Hi, want to hear something scary?
Lane and Alani were walking home late on New Year's Eve after a party. It was Lane's idea to take a shortcut through the woods, using the light of their cell phones to help see the way. The ground was icy and very slippery, but Lane was stubborn and refused to admit the path was dangerous. They were about halfway through the thick trees when they heard a branch snap behind them. "Hello?" called out Lane, confident as ever. There was no reply, but there was another noise. Lane was about to ask again when out of nowhere, a figure appeared with a hatchet. It was a young teen in pigtails and a dirty blue school uniform. Suddenly, she screamed and swung the hatchet into Lane's head. Alani tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and she was knocked out cold. When she woke up, she was surrounded by shadowy figures. She stood up slowly, realizing she was still in the woods. Her head throbbed. Leaning against a tree for support, Alani noticed the young woman wearing a ripped mask over her nose and mouth. "A pleasure to have some new blood." She motioned for Alani to follow her. Alani obeyed. More of the figures had appeared. Alani whimpered as she was dragged into the circle of people. One wore a beige trench coat and a white mask. There was also the teen with pigtails, wearing a filthy and now bloody blue school uniform. And another person with gray skin, no eyelids, no hair. Despite their odd appearances, it was the final being who caused her stomach to drop. He stood over 8 feet tall with a face as blank as death. His limbs and torso were long and slender. The tall, thin man advanced and raised a hand. Alani was paralyzed. Suddenly, her eyes started to close, head still swimming. She fell to the ground, unconscious again. When she awoke in a darkened room, something was very different. She felt changed. Looking down, she saw she was now wearing black leather gloves. Her festive party dress was now a dark trench coat. She was wearing military fatigues and military-type boots. Most surprisingly of all was a 3-foot sword in a sheath at her waist. She drew the weapon and admired how the blue and silver blade caught the moonlight coming in through a window. And she was overcome with an urge to use it, to hurt someone, to kill someone. Alani turned to see the teen with pigtails. She handed over a mask and grinned. Alani examined it. "Put on the mask," Pigtails insisted. "Join Slenderman's ranks." Unable to control her actions in a nightmare, Alani screamed as her hands acted on their own accord. Her scream cut off as her own hands pulled the mask over her face. All remaining thoughts about her past were wiped clean. All memories were replaced, and she felt the certainty of her new purpose, a surging strength and desire to kill. Pigtails watched her, her head cocked to the side like a bird. "Now you will serve as an agent of Slenderman, obeying all that is instructed." Alani nodded, picking up her new weapon, the sword, watching as her colleagues, her new family, entered the room. She turned to look at herself in the mirror. Her eyes glowed in different colors, one amber, the other all black. "Let's spill some blood," she said hollowly. Only serving Slenderman's will remained. She no longer remembered her past life. Alani was gone. She now lived for the thrill of purging those that did not follow him. The group exited the woods, heading for the festively decorated houses in the distance, towards the sounds of New Year's gatherings and other parties. Her new life as an agent of Slenderman had begun. This new year would belong to him and his now loyal minions. He controlled her now, and she would kill or die for him. No questions asked.
Until I was 13 years old, I lived in a small village in Scotland. It was a very peaceful and serene area with a gentle river not too far away. I lived in a house with my mother and grandmother. I'd never met my father. I figured he left the family before I was born. Neither my mother nor grandmother ever talked about him, so I never really asked about him. It was the morning before my 13th birthday. My mom came into my room and sat on my bed. She jokingly asked if I wanted a unicorn for my birthday. Like most little girls, I had a horse phase, but I was slowly growing out of it. So I just told her that I'd love some more books. There actually was something that I wanted for my birthday, but I didn't think my mom would be happy about it. I'd be fine with just the books. I loved to read, after all. One of my favorite things to do was go out into the nearby forest, lean against my favorite tree, and read a book. And that's what I did later that day. I tucked my copy of Where the Red Fern Grows under my arm and walked to my spot. I was lost in my book for maybe 15 minutes when I was interrupted by a sound. It sounded like the neigh of a horse. I thought it was really odd, so I decided to see where it was coming from. It led me to the river. Standing by the water was the most beautiful and majestic white horse I'd ever seen. Its coat was smooth and shiny, its mane was long and luxurious. It turned its sparkling black eyes toward me, and I felt compelled to go closer. I know it sounds strange, but 12-year-old me felt as if the horse was asking me to ride it. I didn't hear the words, but I felt it inside me. It was so weird. I continued to approach the magnificent beast when I heard my mother's voice, not in my head, but echoing among the trees. I snapped out of my trance and began to walk back home, bidding the mysterious horse goodbye. At the dinner table, I told my family about the horse that I saw. They both stopped and looked at me. "Are you sure it was a horse that you saw?" my mother asked. "The forest can play tricks on your eyes." "I'm positive it was a horse," I replied. "It was so beautiful. What do you think it was doing out there?" "I don't know what it was you saw, but you should probably stay away from the river. It's not safe." I remember feeling really confused and frustrated by their response to my experience. Why didn't they just believe me? The next morning, I woke up to my mom singing happy birthday to me in my room. She said my grandma had gone into town for a special birthday surprise, so we would celebrate when she got back. My mom asked me what I wanted to do while we waited, and I told her that I was really close to finishing my book and just wanted to do that. So I went back to my favorite spot and began to read. Moments later, I heard someone calling my name. "V. Hey, V." I looked up, and there was a kind-looking woman, possibly in her 20s, peering from around a tree. "You're Douglas's daughter, no?" I cocked my head at her in disbelief and replied, "How did you know?" She smiled warmly and gestured for me to follow her. "He wanted you to have this for your 13th birthday. Come, now." I knew I wasn't supposed to follow strangers deeper into the forest. I knew that. But she knew who I was, so maybe she wasn't a complete stranger. I closed my book and followed her. She led me to the same clearing by the river I was at yesterday. And there it was, the same white horse. "It's all yours, dear. Happy birthday." The horse seemed to nod its head at me, almost as if reassuring me that, yes, all of this was true. My father was out there somewhere and sent this horse as my birthday gift. I had so many unanswered questions, but in that moment, all of my concerns sort of drifted away. The only thought on my mind was that I needed to ride that horse. It was even more gorgeous up close. As if under a spell, my hand reached out to stroke its mane. But after one stroke, I realized something was very wrong. My hand was stuck. It wouldn't come off. While I frantically tried to pry it off, I heard the woman laughing maniacally behind me. Then suddenly, a gunshot. I turned around to see the woman's body on the ground morph into the body of a dead black horse. And a few feet away was my grandmother, aiming a gun right at me with a cake box at her feet. Please forgive me, V. Now hold still. I ducked my head and felt liquid fire tear through my fingers. She had shot my hand. I grabbed my bleeding digits with my other hand and screamed wildly. But I was free. I ran toward my grandmother while the horse's body began to shrivel and fall into the river. After my grandmother had bandaged my hand and I had calmed down, I asked her what the hell happened back there. I am so sorry, V, she said, but I had no choice. That Kelpie was going to drag you into the river and drown you. Kelpie? What's a Kelpie? They're malicious horses that live near the water. They can shapeshift into human beings to try and trick you into riding their sticky bodies. That's actually how your father died. I took a moment to let that new information sink in. But why didn't we move? Why didn't we leave this area? Because we didn't want to believe that's what happened, V, my mother cried. We moved to the city shortly after, far away from any large body of water. I may have lost a piece of me that day, but I also got my birthday wish. I finally learned the truth.
Due to public health mandates and then a huge renovation, Camp Chaturanga in Illinois had been shut for 2 summers. So when the camp announced a limited reopening, 12 teenagers, anxious to be reunited with their old pals, jumped at the chance to attend. The first week was filled with kayaking, campfires, and s'mores. Late one night in Cabin Bluethorn, when all the adults and counselors were hopefully fast asleep, 6 of the 12 campers used the Ouija board, played light as a feather, stiff as a board, and then started telling scary stories. The night was off to a fun start, but when Joelle began to tell her story, the others grew quiet. Joelle shared an urban legend that she had just learned of. Candyman. A man with a hook for a hand and a taste for murder. Among other things, he was known to lure kids with candy, and if his hook didn't get you, a swarm of bees would. The others held their breath as Joelle said that she'd been told that there was one way to guarantee a meeting with Candyman, but only if you were brave enough to do it. You have to say his name, Candyman, 5 times while looking into a mirror. Her friends chuckled at the absurdity of the tale before quickly looking around for a mirror. The only one big enough they could find was in the cabin's bathroom, and there was no way they'd all fit in there. So, closing the door to the small bathroom, Joelle instead suggested using the selfie feature on her phone. That way, the entire group could do it together, which was great, as no one wanted to do it alone. They huddled around Joelle's phone, everyone in frame, their faces reflected back at themselves, waiting. And so, it began. In unison, they chanted, Candyman, 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 Candyman. Everyone took a breath and looked at each other. Should they? Candy. Just then, a shadow moved quickly in the selfie frame behind them. They all jumped and screamed, scrambling and searching around. Outside the window was Leisha, another camper. Behind her in the distance were the other campers playing hide and seek with flashlights. She asked what they were doing. Joelle explained, asking if she wanted to join them. Nope, she said, running back to the game outside. So after calming down and regrouping, it was time to try again. They all huddled in and began their chant, this time at a faster pace. They said his name once, twice, 4 times, then all together for a 5th time. Candyman! For a brief moment, nothing happened. Until they all began to giggle. How ridiculous they all felt for believing in such a made-up story. Then the bathroom door flew open, the force of it making the wooden door splinter against the wall. Standing there, cloaked in darkness, was a figure. It was well over 6 feet tall, wearing a long coat with wool lapels. Slowly, stepping out of the small enclosed space, it raised its arm, revealing a hook embedded into the stump. A deep, rusty voice answered, "Yes." The teens scattered, screaming. One teenager raced for the door, but with a swift swing of his arm, Candyman gutted her. 2 others were trying to escape out the window, but his hook ended up in both of their backs, impaling them like cattle about to be hung. While retrieving his hook out of their bodies, the 3 remaining campers made it outside, crying for help. They kept looking back at the cabin, but he wasn't coming after them. The other campers ran over, unsure what to believe, but seeing there was trouble, grabbing their crying friends as they yelled about the man who came out of the bathroom. They all headed towards the counselor's cabin in the distance. Suddenly, they heard humming coming from Cabin Bluethorn. Ow! Joelle looked at her arm. She'd been stung. Bees! She screamed. Everyone took off running, but the swarm separated the 3 survivors from the others. Over 5,000 bees moved like one giant body, stinging the remaining selfie campers from Cabin Bluethorn. All the others could do was run for help. Within minutes, there was silence. The remaining bees flew off into the night, and all that remained were 3 almost unrecognizable, bloated and punctured bodies. No hook-handed man was ever found. No one brought to justice for the murders. The bees could not be explained even by nature experts. As for the 6 other campgoers, well, they'll be staying at home next summer, staying far away from reflective surfaces, and will never, ever dare to say his name, just in case he's waiting to finish off the job. It was Christmas Eve, and Vitlome was stressed. She'd been working around the clock to make ends meet, and she desperately hoped she wasn't forgetting something as she trudged through the snow. She cursed again at living in the Icelandic countryside. The bus dropped her a 30-minute walk from her door. Still, the sight of seeing her children's excited faces kept her going. As she got closer to her house, she was surprised to see it in eerie darkness. Usually, she was greeted by twinkly lights decorating the trees along the driveway. Elga couldn't have gotten Anna and Johan to bed already. Juggling packages to find her key, she didn't notice anything unusual as she opened the door. "Hello?" she called, entering the hallway. But instead of 2 small children running into her arms, she was greeted by silence. "Elga? Anna, Johan, where are you?" Again, nothing. Maybe they wanted to surprise her with gingerbread and suspiet cookies, although the smell of spices was noticeably absent. Rushing to the kitchen, she was hit instead by a vile stench. Suddenly, she slipped, landing in a pool of something warm and sticky. Struggling to stand, she finally managed to push herself up, and the carnage was revealed. Blood. And sticking out from the other side of the kitchen island was a leg. She screamed at the sight of the babysitter, Elga, or what was left of her. The babysitter's body had been ripped apart, teeth and claw marks evident on the remaining flesh. But Vitlame had no time to mourn the teen. She raced up the stairs to her children's bedrooms. She could only hope and pray whatever had gotten in, a wolf, maybe a bear, had not found her babies. She flung open Anna's door. The room was empty. She cried out for Johan and ran towards his room. Her heart stopped. He lay on the floor, his small body broken, covered in bite marks. As she threw herself on top of her son's body, she heard a noise from the closet. She grabbed the lamp from Johan's nightstand and crept towards the door, raising the lamp upwards to be ready to strike. She tripped and fell as something small launched out of the closet and into her arms. "Mama!" Anna sobbed. Vitlame hugged her daughter tightly, Anna choking back sobs as she looked at Johan and then pointed at Vitlame's door. "It went there," she whispered. Vitlame edged towards her bedroom, freezing as she heard the noise. A low growling, almost like a rumble, almost like a purr. Placing Anna behind her, she looked into the hallway where Johan's attacker was revealed. It was a giant black cat-like creature, the size of a panther with glowing red eyes. Its back was arched, razor-sharp claws extended, and when it opened its mouth, she could see rows of tiny, dagger-like teeth. It was the Yule cat, the Yulakoteren. The wooden floor around its feet stained scarlet, evidence of the lives it had cruelly taken. She shook with fear as the terrifying creature stalked towards them, Anna bearing herself into her mother's back. She had already witnessed what this beast was capable of, the bodies of her son and Elga testament to its violent nature. Trembling, she just hoped it would be sated with her and leave Anna unscathed. It stepped closer, staring into her eyes, glowing orbs mesmerizing. It took a long, deep sniff. Vitlame prepared herself for the pain, and then the monster just walked away and out of the house. Vitlame sank to her knees, hugging Anna in relief. She thought the legend of the hungry Yule cat who roamed the Icelandic countryside on Christmas Eve was just a story to encourage hard work. According to the old tale, the gift of new clothes, whether they be coats, socks, or whatever, were the only protection against the monstrous feline. She looked down at the new work trousers she'd had to buy, at the new pajamas Anna was wearing because she'd torn her old pair. She whimpered, remembering Johan's new onesie that she'd had to return since it was too big. How could she have known the legend was real and the dire consequences of simply forgetting to buy him another? Vitlame and Anna's new attire had saved their lives. The Yule cat had been hunting, but perhaps the bland, off-putting smell of new clothing had masked the smell of the seasoned food the Yulakoteren had craved. So it left them behind, slinking off into the night, following more scents to other fresh meat. It was the first holiday without Uncle Reuben. The table where my granny, mother, and I sat for Christmas Eve dinner felt incomplete without him. My mother placed his settings and poured hot cocoa into his favorite mug. It felt like things would never be the same. He was such a big part of the family. Looking down at the cup, my eyes welled with tears. His cheerful laughter echoed in my memory, and I could remember clearly the jingling sound of his pockets. They were always filled with coins. You could hear them when he stood up from the table or wandered around the halls. Around the house, you could find little piles where he'd leave change he'd find on his walks. As my mother and I hung the stockings for the first time without Uncle Reuben, I thought about how every Christmas he'd fill them with his most prized coins. Santa left something extra, he'd say, but we knew it was him filling them while we slept on Christmas Eve. This year would likely be the last in our home. Granny and Mom weren't able to meet the mortgage payments and the bank was about to take the house. First Uncle Reuben, and now the place I'd spent my whole life in. Granny fell asleep watching A Christmas Carol before finishing her hot cocoa. As my mom got ready to leave for her night shift at the hospital, I took their mugs into the kitchen. When I went to grab the one we left out for Reuben, I was surprised to find it empty. Curious, I asked my mother if she had drank it. Guess Uncle Reuben didn't want to miss Christmas, she laughed. Under the festive lights that lined my window, snow fell quietly outside as I lay awake in my bed. It was way past my bedtime, but I found it hard to sleep. That's when I heard the jingle. It couldn't be, could it? Was I finally going to catch a glimpse of Santa? Shivering in my pajamas, I got out of bed. I felt something cold under my feet, and much to my surprise, it was a coin. The hallway was dark, but it looked like someone was walking around the house as shadows formed around the lit Christmas tree. Suddenly, there was a crash coming from the rear of the house and the sound of the back door opening. Gasping, I raced to Granny's room as she opened the door just enough to let me in. Immediately, we called the police and huddled together to wait. The jingling passed by the door again. Granny handed me a pair of slippers and opened her bedroom window. We would make a run for it. Once on the ground, we made our way around the back of the house to get to the car. Granny motioned for me to go ahead, but as I crossed the driveway, the burglar saw me. "Hey," he yelled, and that's when a man's shadow appeared as if from nowhere.
"Get out!"
He boomed at the intruder. The voice shook the house and the burglar jumped as if he'd seen a ghost. He broke into a run toward Granny and me. With a snap, I pulled the hanging Christmas lights down from the doorway. The burglar tripped over the string of lights. With a thud, he landed in the snow, covered in twinkling lights, as a police car approached. When they took him in, he was raving about being paid to scare us out of the house. After my mom got home and gave her statement to the cops, we went back inside. That's when I noticed a big pile of very shiny gold coins sitting on Uncle Reuben's place at the table. A shadow moved toward the living room away from it, with the familiar sound of change following it. "Merry Christmas," I called out as that jingle faded away. In the end, we didn't lose the house thanks to Uncle Reuben's Christmas surprise. To this day, I still find gleaming coins around the house whenever we miss him most. It's his way of letting us know he's still looking after us.
"'Twas the night before Christmas, and deep in our bunker, my mom, dad, sister, and I did hunker. The streetlights were dark, no carolers sang, not even the blessings of old church bells rang. And beneath our beds, we all huddled tight and hoped he would pass by our house tonight. Everyone knows of jolly Saint Nick and the gifts that he brings on his single night trick, and the presents and baubles and candy and toys that he brings every Christmas to good girls and boys. But it wasn't the man with red suit and white beard whose annual Christmas visit we feared. Outside in the snow, we heard a loud howl, the crunching of ice, and an animal growl. I heard it sniff by our window pane, then a deep, throaty laugh, and saw red eyes like flame. My sister and I both stared, horrified, and prayed that the creature could not get inside. But a moment later, a thundering pound turned our door to splinters all over the ground. I screamed as the creature into our home came, this horrible beast, Von Krampus by name. He was massively tall, at least 7 feet, from the points of his horns to his hoof-shodden feet. Across his back, what I mistook for a coat was the shaggy long hair of a filthy dead goat. And I cried and I swallowed my terrified pangs at the sight of his wickedly razor-sharp fangs. His claw-fingered hands looked ready for pain. In one was a bullwhip, the other a chain. He growled and he sneered and laughed for a while. Then he pointed at us and said,
"Naughty."
with a smile. My sister and I both shook with fear. What terrible things had we done this year? We tried to be good and thought we succeeded. We minded our manners, no punishment needed. We both made good grades. We neither one lied, or cheated, or stole. We had nothing to hide. But Krampus still came, with his evil heart black, to steal us away, stuff us in his sack, to take us away to his punishment cave, where all the bad children forever his slaves. We turned to our parents behind them to hide, but they both shook their heads and sadly stepped aside. You must face the music, my father lamented. Von Krampus then laughed, his expression demented. My sister and I hugged each other tight and prayed that someone could save us that night. And just when we gave up and all hope was gone, there came a loud clatter from out on the lawn. With a tinkle of bells, our spirits did lift. Von Krampus snarled, the air he did sniff. On the wind came the scent of holly and pine, of gingerbread cookies and holiday wine. In the doorway he stood in his suit of bright red. St. Nicholas came. We cried out and said, "Save us, St. Nicholas, there's been a mistake. We've been good all year. You can't let him take." "Hold on, not so fast." He raised his great hand. "There is something happening you don't understand. Von Krampus did come, that much is true. But the demon of Christmas did not come for you." At the demon we stared, both of us confused. He had to be here for somebody, but who? Then I started to think, and all became clear. Who'd been the naughtiest of all that year? The more that I thought, the more I understood. We children were fine, but the parents, no good. "But Krampus takes children," my father protested, and Santa's face twisted toward the man he detested. "Christmas time is for children and gifts to be given. You took their innocence, and that can't be forgiven. You scared them into silence, their souls you did twist, and to top it off told them I didn't exist. For your lifelong naughtiness, the piper must be paid," and set Krampus upon them with a dismissive wave. The adults screamed as they went into a sack, and we cried until Santa patted my back. "What's wrong?" asked St. Nicholas. "I thought you'd be happy to be rid of those people who treated you crappy." "We are," I sniffed, sincere as could be. "But what is to become of my sister and me?" St. Nicholas smiled and laughed loud and deep, as did Krampus, a sound that still haunts my sleep. "Why, you'll come with me," he said with great joy. "I have great use for a good girl and boy. You'll come to my workshop and work with my elves. I promise that you will enjoy yourselves. I'll teach you my secrets, my toy-making ways, and then you'll take over when I've ended my days." "But," said my sister, "what about him? Won't Krampus be lonely?" She scratched his chin. "I wish to thank him, and I know the way. I will go with him and be his protege." And so, from Kris Kringle, I learned to make toys, and my sister to torture naughty girls and boys. And every evening from that point thereafter, my dreams were full of parent screams and my sister's laughter. And so this ends our happy Christmas story. If you're nice and not naughty, you've no need to worry. But if your heart's full of coal and you're an evil mister, try to hide, but you'll soon meet Krampus and my sister.
One night, Regina slept over at her cousin Tiff's while her aunt and uncle were on an overnight work trip. The girls made a blanket fort in Tiff's living room and stayed up late to tell each other spooky stories. Tiff's family had only recently moved into the house, but she was anxious to tell her cousin a story about her new home. Apparently, 10 years ago, the first owners of this house claimed their young daughter Ella had gone missing, began Tiff. They were in the living room, watching TV, when they heard their daughter's screams from the bathroom. There was scratching and whimpering coming from behind the door. The father shouted Ella's name, but there was no response. When the dad managed to kick down the bathroom door, they nearly fainted at what they saw. The floor and walls were covered in blood. Scratches covered the shower curtain, and in the bathtub, the water was stained with blood. But Ella was gone. The room was empty. door locked. But the window, the light of the full moon shone through the window that something had crashed through from the outside. The lack of evidence led the police around in circles, but the girl was never found. Sometime later, a neighbor went out to feed their dog and found another dog hogging the bowl. But it was a weird dog, hairless all over, long black hair on its head. It looked like a human girl, but it had a snout and jaw like a dog. Snarling, it turned and ran off on all fours. Other neighbors saw the dog girl too, and even recorded footage that made it onto the news. The police made a DNA match on a piece of hair it left behind. The dog girl was Ella. It turns out that after she'd somehow been transformed into this wild thing, she tried to go back home, but her parents couldn't handle her and tried to abandon her in the wild. When they were caught neglecting her, the dad committed suicide, and the mom was locked away for abandoning their child. "What happened to Ella?" Regina asked. They didn't know what to do with her either. She was half child, half dog, Tiff continued. They say she was taken into a lab or sanctuary, but before they could figure out what to do, she got loose. And people still see her wandering the streets to this day. A sudden growl and barking surrounded the tent, and Regina jumped out and onto the couch to see a video of a barking dog on the living room TV. Tiff rolled on the ground with laughter. Regina stormed out of the room and huffed that she was going to go brush her teeth. As Tiff was catching her breath, she suddenly heard scratching and tapping on the tile in the front hall. "Regina, I thought you went to the bathroom." Tiff peered into the darkened hallway and saw a figure in the dark, sniffing around on all fours like a dog. The scratching intensified. "Hey, Regina, sorry about the joke, but can you stop that?" At the sound of her voice, Tiff watched as the figure froze, focused on her, and started to growl low in its throat, then began approaching her on its hands and feet. "Regina," Tiff whimpered, feeling the cold draft blow in through the now open front door. As the shape stalked closer, Tiff realized it wasn't Regina at all. Out of the dark emerged a large, pale snout with snarling fangs and a head of long, tangled black hair. Its human-like eyes locked with Tiff's as the beast's shuddering jaw growled and dripped foam, steam panting off its breath. Its claws tapped and scratched on the tile. The claws were attached to limbs, resembling human hands and feet. It agilely crept closer. "Ella?" Regina would never forget the unearthly snarling, tearing, and screaming she heard from the hall as she came out of the bathroom, hands still wet from the sink. She had no way to explain to Tiff's parents or authorities the trail of blood and evidence of struggle that had been dragged through the front door. When Tiff's mangled remains were found, her death had been ruled as an animal attack. But deep down, Regina knew Ella had come home.
We're a really tight-knit family. It's myself, my little sister Tess, our mom, and our grandma. Our house is filled with so much love from both our mom and grandma. We're also regular churchgoers. Don't get me wrong though, Tess and I had to go back in the day, but now that I'm older, I can stay home and take care of both of us. We get to decide if we want to go or not, which is nice because I'm not always up for it. And one day, I got to be home alone with Tess and learned about her past lives. But a lot of it just seemed like stuff she had seen on TV, or maybe she had learned it at school. For example, she had stories like riding in a wagon drawn by horses while wearing a yellow dress, walking through the streets of Victorian London, sitting in front of a small black and white TV as she watched the incredible moon landing unfold before her eyes. All these things were impressively descriptive, and yet not impossible for a first grader to know about. And while I might have been somewhat open-minded, we did not tell my mom and Gran in case they didn't approve or didn't believe her. But things started seeping in into her daily life, like referring to something in a really old-fashioned way. She asked to use the loo at school. She tried to make a cup of tea with milk, which might be fine and all, except these are expressions that are commonly associated with British culture, which we are not. Sometimes she said weird stuff and my mom told her off. But when she began sleep talking in Dutch, they took a notice, especially when Gran told us we had Dutch heritage. Tess looked right at Mom and Gran and told them straight up she died many times before, and in one of her past lives, she lived in Holland with our ancestors. Now, this was all rather entertaining, strange, and yet innocent until that day, Friday the 13th. Tess had been studying superstitions at school, and when she got home, she couldn't wait to ask us about black cats and knocking on wood. We were all sitting at the kitchen table enjoying a meal of spaghetti. Tess was also eating all the garlic bread and not sharing, so Mom told her to pass it around and offer some to Gran. Gran shook her head and smiled, joking that maybe her inability to eat garlic wasn't because of indigestion, but because she might be a vampire. Mom laughed and asked Tess if she had learned about that superstition too. We were expecting Tess to laugh along, but instead, she had a very weird, serious look on her face. "No, Granny, you can't eat garlic because it reminds you of when I was in your tummy." I burst out laughing at the odd statement, but Mom and Gran were shocked. What do you mean, Tess?" asked Mom. "You were never in Gran's tummy. You were in mine because I'm your mommy." Tess looked at Mom like she was dense. Gran stayed silent. "I know that, Mommy, but before I was in your tummy, I was in Gran's tummy. But I was going to be a boy, so I choked and died. Then Gran nearly died too, so I had to wait quite a while before I could go into your tummy." Gran let out a sob as Mom's eyes grew wide with fear. Later, Mom told me something that only a handful of people knew. About 25 years ago, Gran had fallen pregnant. It had been a miracle since after Mom had been born, Gran and Grandpa had not been able to conceive again. But in a tragic turn of events, around 8 months into the pregnancy, the baby had died. The umbilical cord had wrapped around its neck, and the baby had choked in the womb. The surgery after had complications, and Gran had flatlined for a few minutes. It had all been very traumatic and had never really been spoken of since. And Gran had never told anyone that the baby had been a boy, not even my mom. There was no way Tess could have known about this, and it seems completely impossible that a 6-year-old would make it up. And the even weirder thing, the due date of that baby, 15 years before, had been Friday the 13th.
Gabriel didn't like having to leave his heavily pregnant wife and son when he traveled for work to Manila. But not only did he have to pay the bills, but he had to pay off the huge gambling debt he'd accumulated over the years. His family knew nothing about his secret addiction or the amount of money he owed, and now there would soon be another mouth to feed. He needed to take any work offered to help pay it off. This particular construction job had come without warning, and he had had little time to figure out a sitter. Luckily, he'd found a woman named Ning through an online posting. She said she could look after Josh, and she could also stop by to do the chores. Despite not knowing a thing about her, she reminded him of his grandmother, and he was desperate. She'd appeared at the perfect time. The first day Gabriel was away, Ning picked Josh up from school and made dinner. In the evening, Josh rubbed oil on his mother's feet and helped her to bed, like his dad had instructed him. After tucking her in, he looked back to make sure she was safe and comfortable. He smiled, and he went into his own room to get some rest. Around midnight, Josh was awakened by strange noises coming from his mother's room. He leapt up from his bed to rush to her aid. He swung the door open and was greeted by a terrifying vision. Peering down at his mother from the ceiling was a horrific-looking creature. Its lower torso seemed to be missing, entrails flapping from where the stomach ended. Sure enough, with a quick dart of his eyes, Josh confirmed the lower half of the body stood in the corner of the room, macabrely awaiting reattachment. Huge leathery bat wings kept it afloat, and an enormous elongated tongue protruded from its maw. When it looked at Josh, he had a glimmer of recognition. This thing was Ning, the mysterious sitter. "Mom," She heard him and begged for help, and he knew he had to do something before the monster destroyed his mother and unborn sibling. She was weeping and praying for her baby, but seemed unable to move. "She's a manananggal. Josh, you must kill her and save your sibling." Josh felt the room sway as he fought to stay conscious, terror washing over him. Manananggal is a creature that during daylight looks like a normal human, but when on the hunt, separates from its lower body and grows wings. This allows it to fly and maneuver easily towards its prey. The 4-feet-long proboscis-like tongue was designed with one sole purpose: to suck the blood of pregnant mothers and to suck up the fetus. Despite his fear, he grabbed his father's baseball bat and began swinging at the beast's wings. It hissed at Josh with vampire-like fangs. He went in to hit it again, but this time it used its massive wing to knock him against the wall, the bat flying under the bed. Josh desperately searched for another weapon, but the monster was back over, tongue extended. She tried to cover her belly, but the creature used its human arms to pin her down. Josh panicked, sensing only one choice left. "Take me instead," he cried out, his voice cracking. "Leave my mom. You can have me, all my blood." "No," sobbed his mom, but the Manananggal was interested. It swung its wing at her face, knocking her out, then swooped over to Josh. Despite his terror, he felt noble, knowing his father would have been proud that he'd sacrificed himself for his mama and the baby. The creature grabbed Joshua by the neck and bit, sinking in its fangs. Blood spilled all over them, splattering the walls, and then threw his body with such force he smashed through the window, landing outside. Poor Josh was dead before he hit the ground. The Manananggal lapped up the residual blood, but was unsatisfied. It extended out its proboscis. Air whistled eagerly into the elongated tubular tongue as the monster headed back to the unconscious mom. As blood soaked the sheets, it took mere moments to suck the fetus out of the navel and swallow it whole, leaving the mother to bleed to death alone. The following morning, just a day after his departure, Gabriel entered his family's home. He walked about the living room, shouting for everyone. He had made a decision he was excited to share. He had postponed the job for now. Despite the pressure to pay the debts, it hadn't felt right to be away. He'd just have to continue hiding his gambling for now and somehow work extra hard once the baby was born. As he put his things down and wondered why no one was answering, he made his way to his wife's bedroom. As he fell to his knees in horror, gasping for air, Ning entered with a basket of laundry. She screamed and dropped it, running to console Gabriel, appearing as shocked as he was at the devastation. The massacre she, the Manananggal, had caused. For years after, Ning stayed, practically attached to Gabriel's side, a faithful housekeeper, a doting friend of the family, including when he remarried. And when the happy couple announced they were expecting twins, well, you can imagine Ning's delight.
Pastel and Greg were a happy young couple in love. One of their passions was traveling. They loved to gaze upon the natural beauty of the world. It was how they felt closer to God. Their favorite spot to visit was Mines View Park, a cliff with a spectacular view. That's where Greg proposed to Pastel and where they held their simple wedding ceremony. Not too long after, Pastel became pregnant with their first child. Pastel and Greg, being a very good-looking couple themselves, were constantly showered with assurance from their friends and family that their baby would, too, be beautiful. In the months leading up to their baby's birth, they prepared the nursery and bought many toys and clothes. They spared no expense. They had traveled all over the world to see God's beautiful creations, but they knew nothing would be more beautiful than the new life they would soon be blessed with. They were ready to see God in their new child. The day finally came. Pastel had chosen to give birth naturally in their home, in a tub. She was in labor for quite a while, and Greg was starting to become concerned, but the midwife assured them that everything was fine. After many tiring hours, their baby was born. Congratulations, you have a healthy little girl. The couple smiled down at their little miracle, but only for a fleeting moment. The baby's eyes were large and uneven, almost bulging out of her skull. One of her ears was folded over entirely. One of her arms was shorter than the other. Is she okay? Pastel asked the midwife. Oh yes, she's a very healthy young girl. Despite these minor abnormalities, she will live a long, happy life. Congratulations again. You are so lucky. What are you naming her? The couple didn't answer. Later that night, neither one of them could sleep. They just sat in bed, their thoughts racing through their minds. Their unnamed baby, however, was sleeping peacefully in her crib. Pastel turned to Greg. "That's not our baby," she said coldly. "I don't see God in that child. I see the devil." Early the next morning, Pastel and Greg decided to visit Mines View Park, thinking it would raise their moods. Pastel carried the baby in her arms as they approached the edge of the cliff and looked out over the valley. The sun was just barely rising. It was still early enough that no one else was at the park. Pastel took a step towards the edge, and another, and let her arms drop. Greg rubbed her back comfortingly. "We'll try again, honey." A month or so later, Pastel became pregnant again. Every day leading up to her due date, they prayed to God that their baby would be born differently than last time. And she was. Pastel gave birth to a healthy baby girl whose features were a seamless blend of her parents. She was perfect to Pastel and Greg in every way. They decided to name her Angela. On Angela's 4th birthday, they took her to their favorite park so they could show her their special place by the cliff, and that way it could be their special place as a family. But when they entered the gate, Angela began to cry.
"I don't like this place,"
she sobbed.
"Can we go home?"
"We just want to show you our favorite place in the world, darling." Pastel tried to comfort her. "It's just right over there. You're going to love it." Angela was putting up a bit of a fight, and her parents were embarrassed by the scene they were causing. But they managed to get Angela to the cliff, and that's when she completely lost it.
"Mommy, no, please don't hurt me, please."
At this point, everyone in the park was staring.
"Please don't throw me over again, please. I'm pretty now. I came back pretty so you'd love me. Don't you love me?"
Emmy was overjoyed that her grandmother Setsuko agreed to spend time out with her. Given that her grandmother rarely went out, being nearly 100 and tired from a challenging life, it was a big deal. Her grandmother had always been a serious and dedicated woman. Emmy deeply valued these joyful, relaxing moments with her grandmother, especially considering her age and the uncertainty of time she had left with her. Emmy held her grandmother's hand, leading her to the candy store for treats. But as they approached the entrance of the sweet shop, Setsuko froze like she had seen a ghost. She was standing face to face with something that stood outside of the shop, something that was seen in many candy stores across all of Japan, the wooden statue of Peko-chan. Setsuko was panting heavily and clutching her heart with wide eyes. Emmy didn't know what to do. She had led her to a nearby bench where she could sit down. "What's wrong?" Emmy asked. Setsuko took a breath and in a choked whisper told Emmy that she knew that girl. "What girl?" asked Emmy, looking about and seeing no one nearby. Then she saw the statue. "Oh, do you mean Peko-chan?" Peko-chan was the mascot of a Japanese candy called Milky. She's known to have chubby cheeks, pigtails, and a red ribbon in her hair. always seen with a big smile on her face, licking her lips. The company's slogan is "Milky Tastes Like Mama." Emmy was confused. How could her Sobo know the mascot? But Setsuko insisted she knew Peko-chan. The statue's likeness reminded her of a girl she knew during World War II. The girl was named Peko, and she was 6 years old. She lived with her mother in a small Japanese village. During the war, there was a tremendous food shortage, leading people to starve and look for food. Peko and her mother had to drink muddy water just to stay alive. They chewed on grass and the roots of trees as a desperate attempt at keeping their hunger at bay. Finally, Peko's mother couldn't bear to see her daughter suffering any longer, and so she took a knife, cut off her own arm, and offered it to Peko to eat, not telling her what it was. And as Peko ate, she realized she had never tasted anything so good in her life. When she discovered where the meat had come from, she was sick with disgust. But then she remembered the flavor. She couldn't forget the sweet taste of her mother's flesh. When her mother became too weak and vulnerable to defend herself, Peko, overcome by the primal instincts within, proceeded to inflict fatal injuries upon her and subsequently consume the entirety of her mom's body. Addicted to the taste of human flesh, Peko continued her life as a cannibal. "It's just sickening," Setsuko said. "The way they have her licking her lips. It's like the way she licked her mother's blood off her rosy red cheeks." Rearrange the sounds of the word milky, and it becomes "kill me." She continued. Those were Peko's mother's final words, begging her daughter to take her pain away. Emmy started observing the candy in the shop window. She realized the slogan of the company, when translated from Japanese, is "Milky Tastes Like Mama." Emmy had another horrifying thought. "What about Peko-chan?" she nervously asked, instantly regretting the question the moment it slipped from her lips. Her voice filled with a combination of curiosity and apprehension. She couldn't help but wonder what the response would be and how it might shape their conversation. It's important to note, the candy company also has another mascot named Peko-chan. This time, it's a young, smiling boy who always wears a blue hat. He's said to be Peko-chan's boyfriend. Setsuko shook her head sadly. Peko was a 7-year-old boy who lived in Peko's neighborhood. After devouring her mother, Peko was still hungry. So she attacked Peko, breaking open his skull in order to eat his brains. Peko was in such pain that he bit his own tongue and swallowed it before he choked and died. The reason Peko-chan never has his tongue out in pictures on the candy bars is because he doesn't have one. And the reason he always wears a blue hat is to hide his broken skull and missing brains. Setsuko started to cry, the memories becoming all too much. Emmy tried to calm her grandmother, but she knew that the way her grandmother was reacting, that this was deeply something so horrific in her life that it shook her this badly. Also, seeing this smiling, cannibalistic little girl selling yummy treats doesn't help the cause. And who knows what makes them so yummy? After all, the company's slogan is "Milky Tastes Like Mama." As the resemblance between their products and human taste intensifies, one wonders how long it will be until a mere candy fails to satisfy their customers' desires, leaving them yearning for the authentic experience.
Mira Miller could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins. The thrill of the hunt was what drove her and her old college buddies, Jason and Lotus, across the globe to find new game to track in places they didn't need a permit, or at least where they could pay enough money to have officials look the other way. The cotton-top tamarin, an endangered species of primate that lived deep in the Colombian forest, was to be her latest trophy. She was determined to either capture one for the illegal pet trade or hunt it, another distinctive head to mount on the wall of her den. The poacher spoke in hushed whispers as they trudged through the trees, accompanied by the chirping of cicadas and rustles of leaves. After hours of nothing, they heard a screech, the cry of the tamarin. Mira turned her compound crossbow upwards towards the highest branches. As her finger rested on the trigger, a sharp tug yanked at her leg. Mira yelped, tumbling to the ground. Her arrow missed, firing into a tree nearby. "Mira, what the hell? You had it," Jason called. She looked up, the primate long gone. She glared at Jason, seething. "Thanks, a lot," she snarled. Stomping off, she gazed back up at the now ominously orange sky. She'd never seen it look like that before. Mira suggested they all head back to the lodge as it would be getting dark soon. The trio trudged back through the dimming forest in silence. A half-hour passed, and there was no sign of the path they'd previously taken. It was almost as if the landscape had changed. The three of them hadn't spoken for a while, so she assumed the others felt the same way, that they were utterly lost. Before Mira could turn around to confer with them, she heard a noise. A quiet clicking and a rustle of bushes, and something else. She raised her weapon, scanning the menacing trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. She turned. Lotus was crouched, weapon also poised at the trees, but Jason was gone. She was nowhere to be seen. They swore that just minutes earlier, she'd been right behind them. Mira felt disoriented. Lotus looked just as confused. They called out, hoping to hear a response. Instead, there was only a clicking sound and strange shadows just out of sight. Jason wouldn't play this kind of prank. Something was very wrong. As the hair on the back of her neck began to prickle, Mira shouted, "Run!" The women ran, Mira in the lead. Lotus didn't even have time to scream as a large, shadowy creature swooped in and grabbed her from behind. The hunters were now being hunted. Mira was beset with panic and tripped over a loose root on the forest floor. Rubbing her ankle, she realized Lotus was no longer behind her. "Lo?" she called, but as before, she was met only with silence. Limping, she looked ahead at the seemingly impossible. The trees in front of her had somehow blocked her path. She could only retreat, heading backwards. As she did, she felt wet drops land on her cheek, along with the unmistakable stench of copper. Slowly, as her heart thumped with terror, she raised her eyes to the forest canopy. Her legs wobbled and she gagged at the hideous sight. At the top of a canopy were the bodies of Lotus and Jason. The women were tied above with vines that pierced through their bodies like barbed wire. Their insides were wrapped around the vines, painting the dark green forest red. Blood spilled from their mouths, dripping down on her face. As she stumbled and fell to the ground in horror, a long, knotted wooden arm reached towards her, clicking and snapping, its nail sharpened to the peak. Bright emerald eyes glowed within the darkness, illuminating a mass of hair made of leaves. It looked like a woman, but a monstrous woman, with green skin, vegetation and sticks springing up across her body. Her teeth were sharp, spread wide in her crooked, malicious smile. Mira screamed, petrified, as the creature rushed in, swiping with her machete-sharp limb, and then walked back into the forest with her trophy. A few days later, 3 missing persons notices were pasted all across the nearby county, but the bodies of the trio were never found. La Madre Monte, Mother Mountain, was victorious yet again. She slides within the shadows of the forest, watching and waiting for those who trespass and those who break the laws of nature for their own gain. A deadly fate awaits those who dare try.
Thanks so much for listening. Like and share if this video gave you the chills. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications. See you next time.